Okay, thanks for joining everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's session. This is Jason Warman from Pack Genesis, and this is session 4 in our series of IBM Aspera training topics. Today we're going to be covering Aspera shares. Just a reminder that we will have a bit of time at the end of the session today for Q&A. So if anything comes to mind as we're walking through this, please jot it down, and then we'll address those at the end of the session. A quick overview of what we're going to be looking at today. Again, this is all about IBM Aspera Shares, which is one of the web applications that IBM has available for end user interaction via the Aspera protocol. Aspera Shares is more of a FTP style look and feel. In other words, it's much more about files and folders, being able to upload and download based on specific users' credentials, who you are and what specific content that you've been granted access to and what types of permissions that you have to that content. We'll walk through a bit of the architecture and installation, including walking through a live installation of Aspera Shares and attaching it to a high-speed transfer server. We'll give a quick overview of the actual web interface and then dive into the specific administrative features, such as creating nodes, which are just high-speed transfer server machines, creating shares from those nodes, which is the mechanism to make the content available to users, and then authorizing users and groups there. We'll look at some of the specific options in the administration view as far as how to configure the server and what some of those different options mean to you, as well as managing users and groups of users. We'll take a quick look at some alternative clients versus the web interface that we'll be primarily dealing with today, and then a couple of the basic maintenance tasks from an administrative point of view on maintaining your Aspera Share server. Okay, so let me break out of the slideshow and we'll actually just go ahead and get started. I'm going to keep this on the side so we can refer to it as needed. I'm going to start with a quick diagram here, and this is actually the diagram we used in our last session when talking about Aspera Fastbacks. This is actually very similar. So Aspera Shares, again, works as a web application layer that sits on top of a high-speed transfer server, Aspera transfer server. The connection strings look about the same, right? So for an end user coming in through the browser interface, they connect to the Shares web app over standard HTTPS as we would typically think of it. Shares communicates to the high-speed transfer server using the Node API that we've covered before, which by default runs on TCP 9092. So that does everything from giving the directory listings on the raw storage here on high-speed transfer server, as well as authorization for the end user's Connect client, which does lead us to the Connect client, right? This is the piece of software that's installed on the end user interface or end user computer that interacts directly with the transfer server. In other words, this is where the actual data flow is happening over the Aspera Fast protocol. It's in between this Connect client and the high-speed transfer server. Now, one thing that's sort of unique about Aspera Shares and is really one of the most powerful aspects of or options for deployment is that you can have multiple Aspera high-speed transfer servers behind a single Aspera Shares web interface, right? In other words, if I connect these guys up here, if I have high-speed transfer servers, let's say in different data centers, around the world, I can connect them all to a single Aspera Shares interface, right? And from an end user point of view, let's say this first HSTS is in LA, this next one is in New York, and this third one is in London. From an end user perspective, I come through this single pane of glass, this single Aspera Shares web app. I can see shares on any of these machines, and as an end user, it doesn't really matter to me, or you know, if it's not important, I guess I would say it doesn't really matter to me where the content, where the actual files happen to live. Shares can act as sort of an abstraction layer in that sense, right? So that I, as an end user, see a bunch of different folders I've been granted access to. It doesn't really matter to me that one happens to be in LA, another in New York, and another in London. I can just browse through that single shares web app, and then when it comes time to actually make the upload or download, my Connect client, based on instructions from the share server, knows exactly where to go to do that upload or download over the Aspera protocol. You know, the reason this is all really possible is because of the Aspera Fast protocol. So just a reminder there, Aspera Fast is highly performant, and it doesn't really matter, you know, that this distance in between the end user and the transfer server doesn't really matter, right? So even if the end user is on the West Coast of the US, going to LA versus New York versus London, you know, as long as the available bandwidth is the same, of course, that additional latency and packet loss in between the sender and receiver doesn't affect the speed of the transfer as it would with a typical TCP style protocol like FTP. Okay. One more note, you know, we mentioned this during the session about fastSpecs. Similar to fastSpecs, Aspera Shares comes with a few different components under the hood. So there's the web app itself that's fronted by a web server. In the case of Shares, it's actually Nginx acting as that front end. There is a MySQL server that's embedded with the Aspera Shares as well. It's included in the installer, and everything goes into /op/Aspera. It's not something that you may need to maintain separately. I'll say for Shares, the MySQL database is pretty minimal. So it has the configuration info here, but really because Shares is just showing raw storage views and isn't sort of managing the content in the same way that something like fastSpecs is, that MySQL database doesn't really grow to the large sizes that you can see with something like Aspera fastSpecs. Okay, so let's go ahead and hop over and actually get started with an installation. So let me move this over a little bit. So I have my my Linux server here with the Aspera Shares RPM available. Pretty straightforward. Let me just go ahead and kick off the RPM install. That's going to get going. So similar to Aspera fastSpecs, Shares can run on its own server. It can also run on the same server as Aspera high-speed transfer server. I've broken it out here. So this machine is running just the Aspera Shares web app, and then I'm going to connect it to our separate machine that's running HSTS, so you can really see everything under the covers there. Okay, so a little install script, post-install script that does the setup of the initial server here. It's going to take a couple of minutes to run. So while that's going, I'm going to switch over to our high-speed transfer server and start getting that that guy up and running and ready and prepped to be attached to Aspera Shares. So for Shares, kind of coming back to our little diagram here, if you'll recall, the high-speed transfer server uses OS level authentication. In other words, there's an OS user that actually runs the Aspera transfer process here. So what we're going to do in this next step is set up a Shares user on our high-speed transfer server that's going to be used to actually perform the file transfer function. So this is, again, almost like a service account on the high-speed transfer server that's going to be used for end user connections coming through the Shares interface. Okay, so I'm going to, well, let me just run all of these sort of in a batch here. Right. So I am doing a user add for a user named Shares. I'm setting that Shares user's shell to bin ASP shell. bin ASP shell is this is the Aspera shell. This is a sort of a false shell that ships with the high-speed transfer server that ensures that this user can run the Aspera processes but can't log in interactively. In this case, I've also created a directory called /shares_data and changed the owner to shares. Now, of course, you can use any sort of storage that's available on this machine. You know, I'm just making a directory on the root drive here, but this could be an NFS mount or some other sort of a locally attached storage that's available. All right, so the other thing we need to do is configure the aspera.conf file for this new shares user. So I've got a couple of different AS configurator commands that I'm running here. If you'll recall, AS configurator is the tool that manipulates the aspera.conf file, the opt_aspera etc aspera.conf file. So what I'm doing for this username of shares is setting its doc root, its absolute path to /shares_data. I'm saying that for transfers in and transfers out, this user is going to require an authorization token. So this is important, right? This is what's required for the for sort of this SSH bypass that the Aspera web apps use, right? In other words, we've got a well-known SSH key that the Aspera Connect client has. That's not good enough on its own. We're also going to require a unique token that's generated for every transfer session. And then I've put in a random string here for the token encryption key, which is sort of used as a salt for the dynamic session keys. Okay. I'm going to run this AS node admin command. This is the node API utility. I'm creating a new node API set of credentials called shares node with a little password. And then I'm going to associate that node API set of credentials with the shares OS user that I just configured. Okay. We do also need to set up that public SSH key for this user. So let me go ahead and run those commands, just making sure that in shares home directory, there's an SSH subdirectory, copying in the Aspera public key to authorized keys, and then changing the ownership and the permissions, the mode of that file. Okay, let me flip back over here to our shares machine. So by the way, that HSTS is pretty much ready to go now. I've gotten through the post install script for my shares web app. You'll notice here to create an admin user, you have to run this specific command. So let's go ahead and run that. I'm just going to say 2020. The first time that you log in with this this new user that we're provisioning here, we're going to have to change this password anyway. So I'm just using this as a brief example. And now we should be ready to go. So we have our shares web application installed. We have our HSTS prepped and ready to go to be attached in. Let me bring up a web browser and we can continue from there. Okay, Aspera web app.datasneak.net. Okay, first thing, we see a potential security issue here. So this is sort of the SSL piece. The installer will create a self-signed SSL certificate for your new server. You can actually replace that with a proper SSL certificate. So in fact, let's go ahead and do that. So if we go to opt_aspera shares etc nginx, this is where the nginx config is, including the self-signed certificate and key pair that's put there by the installer. So let me just move cert.pem to cert.pem_old and the key to key.old. And then I'll copy in my properly signed certificates from the registrar or from the SSL provider. And let's restart nginx. Opt_aspera shares sbin sv, restart nginx. Okay, so as we can see here in the Etsy Nginx directory, I've moved the old cert and key out of the way. I've copied in my my proper certificate. I've made a chain, so I've copied the chain or intermediate cert that's from my SSL provider and appended it on that same file. And then I've copied my key to cert.key and restarted Nginx. Okay, so back here in my web browser, I now am seeing the proper, no HTTPS SSL warning, but you'll notice I have this invalid host name popping up here on my server. This is actually something that all of the most recent versions of the Aspera web applications have put in, and that's a host name validation option to make sure that the address that the user puts into the browser matches something that's expected on the server side. So a little bit of a host name validation piece here. In this case, for Fastspec, if you'll recall from that session, the installer actually asked us what host name to expect. The shares installer, as of right now, has not been updated to do that, so we've got to update this manually. So this is an opt Aspera shares config. And by the way, this is all in the documentation, all of the crazy paths and everything. But let me go ahead and edit it. So it's the shares.yaml file. And you can see we've got this accepted hosts entry here. So I'm going to say Aspera web app.datasneak.net. This can be a comma separated list. So if you also want to put like an IP address, or if there's like a, .internal or something separate for different users, you can list as many as you like here. Let me save that, and then we will restart the Aspera shares service. So again, opt Aspera shares, use shares config. In the shares.yaml file, we included any host names that we'd like any user to be able to put into their browser to reach this web app. And if we come back here, that should be just starting up again. And now we get the login page. Let me increase this a little bit. I'll put in my initial admin user and password. As you'll see again, I got to put in something new and then log in. And now we have to install a license. So let me go ahead and grab one of those. Be shares. Okay, now we're ready to go. So this is the shares web interface. As you saw, I've logged in as the initial administrator. You can have as many administrator accounts as you like, and we'll go through the user management options in just a bit here. There's really two basic areas inside of the shares interface. This is the admin view. So as you can see, I've got a number of different admin functions and configuration options on the left-hand side here. And then there's the home view. You'll notice here in the upper right-hand corner. So capital H home, capital A admin, these are the two views. And of course, for a regular user, they're not going to see admin at all, they're just going to see home. Here on the home view, I've got a couple of different options on the left-hand side. So I've got a list of shares, a list of nodes, and then recent activity. And even this nodes view, this is again only an administrative function. So just to orient everybody on this terminology, a share is a folder that my specific user account has access to. A node is an Aspera high-speed transfer server that I've configured with this Aspera shares machine. So the shares come from one of the nodes. Let's go ahead and create a node. In other words, attach my high-speed transfer server to this Aspera shares interface. So I'll click on the little plus sign for new node. The first thing here is the name. So this is a friendly name. So I'll say this is my HSTS in Los Angeles. I need to give it the address of this machine. So hststraining.pacgenesis.com and a port. Now the port is the Node API port. So remember that Aspera Shares communicates with all of your high-speed transfer servers over the Node API. So that's what we're pointing at here. Here's my HSTS training. Here's the port, and path is just leave that blank, right? We're not doing anything, in front of that node, that REST Node API. Okay, so I've got my shares node. This is the Node API username and password. I'm going to tell it to not verify the SSL certificate. This is the SSL certificate on the Node API, which right now, this is all internal traffic. So we're using that self-signed cert and create node. Now this is making a connection from, again, my Aspera Shares web app to the high-speed transfer server. This may take just a minute for all of the checks on the background to go through. If I click test again, we now see status is okay. If I click on this HSTS Los Angeles on the left-hand side here, click on the name of it, we're taken to this browse view for this node. So this is actually a representation of the raw file system, which, if you'll remember, our doc root that we set is /shares data. In fact, if I create a new folder here, I'll call this, LA ingest. We can see this new folder under my node, HSTS Los Angeles LA ingest. If I switch back and do an ls and shares data, we'll see that we have this this folder here, right? This directory. So hopefully this makes sense, right? This is a raw representation of what my storage looks like on this HSTS node relative to that doc root. Okay. Now ahead of time, I actually did create another high-speed transfer server just to show everybody what this looks like between the two of them. So this one is called training2.pacgenesis.com. Let me go ahead and add that. So again, you'll see the sort of basics here. This is the friendly name for the node that administrators will see. Here's the host name or IP address, and then 9092, that Node API port, and then my Node API credentials. Okay. Now I've populated on this this New York HSTS server a couple of files already. So if I click on HSTS New York on the left-hand side, you'll see I've got a couple of files and folders there already, incoming and outgoing. So again, this is sort of the raw storage view of whatever my doc root is. And in fact, if I start clicking into these, you'll see I've pre-populated a small number of files as well in each of these folders. Okay, so I've created two nodes. I've got my shares server and my two nodes, HSTS in New York and LA. So just to keep this clean, let me do this to our little diagram. Shares on one server and then two HSTS servers, each with their own storage that's configured on them. Now the node, again, this is these are my servers. This is really just an admin view, though. Only admins see the raw nodes. To make this content visible to end users, I need to create shares. So two ways to do this. You'll notice up here on the upper left, next to shares, there's a plus sign. I can click new share, give it a name, browse my nodes, or I can come in through the node view. So if I click on HSTS New York, choose my incoming folder, I can click create share. So it pre-populates everything for you. Now this first field, the name, this is going to be the friendly name that end users actually see. By default, it's going to take the same name as the directory itself. Sometimes this isn't very useful for end users, or if maybe this the storage is actually a folder that's generated by another process. Maybe your transcoder is dumping files out here. These folder names may not make sense, so you can give this a friendly name here. So let's say this is New York incoming for project limo. Click on create share, and we'll see in the upper left here, I now have a share that says New York incoming project limo. And this happens to be, if I click on detail, on my HSTS New York, and it's mapped to specifically to the incoming directory. Okay, now I haven't actually allowed any users access to this, right? I've created my nodes, I've created one share. In fact, why don't we go ahead and create one more just to have a couple to play with. LA ingest folder, create a share. I'll just call this one LA project 5200 and create the share. Now we actually have to authorize users or groups or entire directories to have access. I'll start with just my user, search for the username and add. Now you can see for individual users or groups of users, for each of these shares, you can grant very explicit access, right? So the most basic one is browse. Can somebody click on it and get the directory listing? That's not super useful though on its own. So let's add download access, upload access, create directories, renames. Let's leave off delete for now. These are all individual permissions that you can set for each specific user or group on a share by share basis. So when an end user comes in, even if there's 100 different shares listed, they'll only see the shares that they have some sort of permission to, and they'll only be able to act on those shares in whatever permissions you've granted, right? If I don't have download access, I'm not going to see the download option. You'll notice one option at the very end here, or actually there's two that are a little bit different, manage and notifications. Manage, this is a way to delegate management of a specific share to an end user. So if I want somebody to be able to, grant permissions on a share, but not give them full admin rights to the server itself, I can give them this manage option. It's sort of a way, again, to delegate permissions on just a specific share instead of system-wide. The other one that's a little bit different is notifications. So there are email notifications here in Aspera Shares. Content availability, if you enable this, will allow each individual end user to subscribe to updates. In other words, when this is turned on and this end user enables those notifications, anytime new content is placed in the specific share, they'll get a little email letting them know, hey, Jason, this is a share that you have access to. Somebody just put new content into it. Okay. So those are some of the basics here, the nodes and the shares. I do want to hop over to the admin view next and take a little bit closer look. So there's a few different things here. We won't go through all of these one by one, but a couple of things that I like to sort of highlight here. Down under system settings, the second one from the bottom, this transfers option, target rates, target rate caps. So we discussed this a bit in our session on high-speed transfer server. You can set at the HSTS level target rates and caps, and also aggregate rates and caps through the VLink, the virtual link process or configuration option. Now, here in the shares application, we can set some specifics that are particular to Aspera shares, right? So for my upload target rate, I can say this is going to be 100 megabits. For a target rate cap, I can say 500 megabits. And let's do the same thing for downloads, right? And again, these are per session, right? So I'm saying that any particular session will start at 100 megabits, but if the end user decides to, they can bump it up all the way up to 500 megabits per session if they like. You'll notice we've got a couple of other options for policies. These are the transfer policies on the high-speed transfer server. Fixed, we never recommend. This basically turns off the congestion avoidance or the rate control on a system, so that this would have the potential of being disruptive on the network. The typical option here is fair, right? This means that all of the Aspera traffic will play nicely with other non-Aspera traffic, and that also Aspera traffic sessions will play nicely with each other and equally set the bandwidth. Now, at an end user perspective, they can set lower or higher priority. So the allowed policies are what you would allow there, right? So I'm going to say in this case, this is sort of a good best practice, fair and low. So by default, everybody's going to run equally. An end user can put their particular session to lower priority if they like. This is important for folks that do a lot of Aspera transfers. If they have 2 downloads going at a particular time, they may want to reprioritize though. One's more important than the other, so they'll give that one lower, a policy of low. You'll notice we've got a couple of encryption policies. So encryption over the wire, we of course recommend turning this on by default. We'll just make sure this is using the AES encryption. Encryption at rest, much like Aspera Fastback's, encryption at rest in this context is passphrase-based encryption. So you can make this optional or required. I typically see this left off in most cases. If this is turned on, anytime somebody uploads a file or folder, they'll be prompted to put in a passphrase, and then anybody who downloads that same content or tries to access it on the raw storage will need that passphrase to decrypt it during or after the download. So it is a powerful tool, but can get a little cumbersome if it's required across the board. Okay, there are some user security options here, particularly around local user accounts like session timeout, strong passwords, failed login counts, these sorts of things. So all available here for configuration. As I mentioned, there is also a set of email notifications that are available inside of Aspera Shares. So you have some toggles here on email, what types of email notifications go out. There are some templates that you can create and customize. So these are the different events inside of Aspera Shares that will trigger an email notification. If I take a look at one of these, like transfer completed, you can see what the defaults here. There's both plain text and HTML options, so you can customize these. This is how they sort of look by default. But again, you can customize any of these with your own branding or own specific language that you'd like to put in. You'll notice here I'm under the email templates that I can customize and even like make a copy of and then customize. There's also a set of variables for email notifications, right? The typical ones that we see are like maybe the footer, right? So if there's a particular legal language that you would generally put for your system-generated emails from your organization, you can edit it once here and then have that popped into all of your email templates. And then, of course, just your SMTP server settings. Of course, Aspera Shares needs to know how to send these emails out, so you can point this at your existing SMTP relay. Okay, So let's get into the other piece, the other major thing that you're going to do as an administrator, and that's manage users and groups. So a few different options in Aspera Shares on how to do that. Here under users on the left-hand side under accounts, I can create any number of new users. Now by default, there is this local database of user accounts. In other words, if I type in somebody's information here, let me put in my colleague Scott, and let's call this just Scott, and put in his email address. We'll send him a login link, or we can set a specific password. I'm going to go ahead and set one here because I'm going to use Scott as an example as we walk through this. So this is creating a new user in the local database. In other words, in the Shares application itself. Now, for a lot of organizations, this is really all you need, right? You can create a number of users locally just within Aspera Shares. As you can see, once I've created Scott's user account, there are some specific options here. There is an option to disable users without deleting them. So this is useful for folks that maybe come on and come off for projects, allowing them to log in, of course. You can make the user an admin, and you can optionally also give API access for a particular user. This might be useful for folks that want to use the Shares APIs themselves, but this is also required if a particular user is going to use something like Aspera Drive, one of the alternative clients for Shares versus coming through the web interface. You'll notice here you can set expiration policies or specific expiration dates for a user. So if I'm creating Scott's user account, but want it only good through the end of the year, I can say, okay, on December 31, this guy's going to automatically disable. Some of the other options here on the user details screen, member of, so you can add this user to groups, which we'll get to in just a second. You can see which shares this user has access to. So I just created this guy. By default, he doesn't have access to anything. And really, there's two ways to add shares to a user account. You can do the way that we did up front, right, where we looked at a share and granted specific users authorizations. We can do that in reverse, right? We can flip that around and say, for this user, let's add some specific shares, right? Here's the two that I have authorized. Let's say that Scott gets for LA Project 5200, he gets download access only. And then for Project Limo, he gets upload, create directories, renames. Right, so this is a good way in reverse to sort of see for a particular user, what do they have access to and what specific access do they have? Right. Home shares are an option in Aspera Shares that I haven't enabled on my server here. Home share is basically sort of a private upload area for a particular user. If you enable home shares, you point to a space on one of your nodes and say for each user, they've got this sort of private space they can upload things. They can share those things out to other users. So it's sort of a more ad hoc way of dealing with collaboration, something that you can enable. Basic preferences, so you can set a time zone. There is a time zone that you can set system-wide, or you can set a specific one for users, or put in little comments. And this is useful if you're doing a lot of these local user accounts, and maybe you just want a little note on who this person is or what projects they're working on. Especially important in a case where you have several different admins for an Aspera Shares server, and maybe different projects or different departments are working with different freelancers and folks on the outside. You may want a little note here on something about this user account. The other thing you'll notice is that there are transfer settings. So those transfer settings that we set system-wide, by default, they are system-wide, right? You can override these for particular users. right? So if I want Scott to have a little bit lower or higher cap, let's say 200 gigs or 200 megs for the default, and then 1 gig for the cap, I can override those for a particular user account. And then in activity, this will show system activity for this particular user. Now there is a group function that you can create. So again, just something to sort of make user and authorization management a little bit easier, right? So I can call this, whatever, project managers, create a group, and then as you'd expect, I can set specific permissions. Have a group have admin access, maybe call it administrators, and everybody that's in that group has admin access. You can also have share authorizations to a group, right? So if I say these are project managers, maybe they're project managers for limo, let's give them manage access to this particular share. Right, so now as new folks come on, instead of granting individual authorizations to each user account, I can simply add that user account to a group and they inherit everything. Similar for those transfer settings. Again, if you want to give, maybe this is like a power users type of group, where you want to give the members of that group higher or lower target rates. Okay, and then finally, there are a couple of options for moving authentication and authorization outside of Aspera shares, right? So everything we've looked at so far, the users and groups of users are in the local shares database. Now we have the option of creating, let's say, a directory, pointing at Active Directory or an LDAP server or one of these other flavors of LDAP server. As you'd expect, put in a little name here. Now we need the host name of the server for Active Directory, right? This is going to be one of your directory servers over a port, typically 389 or 636. We need the base DN to look for groups and users of groups. And then the bind credentials, right? How is the shares app itself going to bind to LDAP or AD? Once this connection is made, you can import any number of users or groups from LDAP. And you can mix and match, right? So you can have some users from LDAP and then some users just local. And in fact, that is a pretty common deployment scenario where, just your internal users, of course, will have their AD accounts, but you may create local user accounts for your external users. The other option, of course, is to use SAML single sign-on for your authentication. So as you'd expect, just the details here, what's the single sign-on URL for my IDP and what are my either the fingerprint or certificate. In the admin guide for shares, there's the specific list of attributes that need to be mapped out in the assertion and how those get mapped back into the details here for Aspera shares. Now, there can be groups that you import from SAML as well. In other words, if your SAML IDP can pass in group membership through like a member of type of attribute, those can be mapped into an Aspera shares group. So useful way of keeping that even that authorization in outside of shares and in your identity management system. So if you have a group called shares admins, you can map that out and entirely inside of your IDP, grant somebody those permissions that's already been set up here on Aspera shares. Okay. One last mention, there is a self-registration option here under user security for Aspera shares. It's turned off by default, but you can turn it on in an unmoderated or moderated way. Moderated, as you expect, if somebody requests a self-registered username, the administrators of the system will get a notification saying this person's requested account, and they'll have to come in here to the user area to approve or deny it. Okay, so pretty straightforward. Shares is a pretty general use case here. Very FTP-like as far as look and feel go, where you just have a number of different users and or different um, users that have access to different content. Let me go ahead and switch out. I do want to show from an end user perspective the difference here. I'm going to log out as my admin and log in using Scott's account that I just created him. Okay, you'll notice a couple of things here now that I've logged in as a regular user account. I don't see the nodes view on the left-hand side. Again, nodes is really just an administrative function. I don't see the admin option in the upper right, I just see my home view. And if I click into these different shares, you'll see that the little action buttons are aware of my permissions, So here in LA Project 5200, I only have the download option. Here in Project Limo, I've got some upload options as well as new folder, rename, create, share, So again, these objects here, these options are aware of what type of permissions that your specific user account has. Right. Pretty straightforward. As we said, this does have a lot of nice use cases for your workflows where you're looking for something very sort of straightforward as far as file and folder based collaboration. One of the really the things that's pretty powerful about Aspera shares is this whole notion that that based on your configuration of the nodes and the shares, this really is just a representation of the raw storage on the back end, So all of these files that I see in the shares interface, these are plain files as is on my Aspera high-speed transfer server. So it makes integrating with other parts of your workflow pretty easy, So if somebody uploads files here into a particular share, they're automatically available. They're not in like a particular format, or they're not managed in a package the way that FastSpecs does things. This really is just a view into the storage. On the other side, if you're automatically generating content or files through other processes, if you can have those files output to disk that line up with one of your shares, they'll automatically show up here in the shares interface. So let's say as files get encoded or transcoded and dumped into this LA Project 5200 folder, they'll automatically show up for me as an Aspera shares user here in the web interface. So we did want to mention a couple of the alternate clients for Aspera shares. Now, most users will just come in through the shares web app interface. It is pretty straightforward. There is also the option of using Aspera Drive, So if I have Aspera Drive installed on either my Windows or Mac machine, I can launch it, tell it I want to tie into Aspera shares, and give it my address, asperawebapp.datasneak. And then the credentials will be the same ones that I use in the web interface. There's a couple of different options here. There is a sync option that would allow one-way or two-way syncing in between an Aspera shares share and then your local desktop. I'm not going to set that up right now. There's also just your standard sort of upload and download type of utility. So if I look in my system tray for Aspera Drive and click on Aspera Drive, you'll see this this little pop-up window. Here's my share server on the left-hand side. Here are my two shares that I've been given access to. Now to upload and download, I can simply drag and drop, right? So I can choose these 3 files, drag them to my desktop. This is going to kick off, you'll see here, an Aspera transfer under the covers using my that same Aspera protocol. So again, this is using, this is all the same utility and function and authentication that you get through the Aspera web interface. It's really just sort of a different user experience to allow drag and drop, and also allow, if your system's configured for it, that synchronization. Now, I'll say one thing about the synchronization: always be careful with that option if you do enable it, because in a lot of scenarios, especially when we're talking about the server side here, these can be gigs and terabytes worth of data. You don't want to get in a scenario where somebody accidentally tries to sync all of that down to their local workstation, or even worse, if they accidentally turn on two-way synchronization and start overwriting files in error. Right? Okay, so Aspera Drive, there is also the Aspera CLI client. Aspera CLI client can be installed on a machine. It gives you a quick way of doing shell scripting to interact. So all of the things that you'd expect here: Aspera shares, browse, Aspera shares, upload and download, are available through that Aspera CLI as well. It's using the REST APIs under the covers, but it just gives you a simple way to script that stuff up without having to dig too far into the to the APIs themselves. Okay, finally, a couple more administrative, sort of maintenance tasks that we wanted to mention. Let me pull up this guy again. So there are a number of different rake tasks that are available here in Aspera Shares. Shares is a Ruby on Rails app. If I switch over here to Aspera Shares, use shares bin, and just make sure this looks okay. Yep. Here's a list of all of the different rake tasks that you can do. So it covers a lot of the things that you would typically do through the web interface, but gives you an option on doing some automation around that. A couple of the ones that I see users use pretty commonly are things like creating users. So especially if you want to do some automation around that, you can see the syntax here. Give it a username, password, email, and then you can assign permissions to it. There's also something you can do, especially if you have a lot of these external users, is do an export. And let's say /temp/json.csv. So this is going to export all of your user accounts so that you have them for your records. You can see it's just a comma delimited file here, so we can see the 2 user accounts that I've set up already. There is an import, by the way. So if you have a comma separated file of user accounts that you'd like to create, you can do this in reverse. Okay. From a backup perspective, there is a backup utility that's included here that will get everything in the shares database, the MySQL database, as well as the config files themselves. Here's the path to it. To Aspera Shares, you set up bin backup and then pointed at a directory. You can see what it's doing here, right? It created a little MySQL dump, and then it's grabbing the actual config files and SSL certs. So if you put this into a scheduler or a cron or something like that, and point it somewhere where you can pick these files up with a typical, regular backup process, this is a good plan to have. Finally, from a log file perspective, again, there are a number of different log files that are available in the system. Now, generally, you won't be looking at these too much unless you're working with somebody like me or somebody on my team, or else with IBM Aspera support specifically. But there are a number of different Aspera shares, var log, a number of different log files for all the different processes, including things like MySQL and Nginx, as well as the web app or application processes themselves in this directory. Okay. Well, I know we've gone over a lot in a short while today. Aspera Shares is pretty straightforward, you know, kind of FTP-like, as we've mentioned a few times here. So the workflows are pretty straightforward, but hopefully this was useful for everybody.